Okay, so I'm really excited that we've got Sumanta and Ravi here with us today. Um, they're here to talk about a new piece of research, which we will make sure that you will get information about how to access that the full report. I think it may have been in the booking form, but we'll make sure you get all that information as well. And also, there may be other events and other activities linked to that report that we will make sure you get information about that in the bulletin. But just to introduce you, we have Sumanta Roy, who's the head of research, evaluation and development at Imkaan. Um, Now, we talk a little bit about Imkaan and include some of Imkaan's work in our training materials. So hopefully you all know who they are. But they are the leading UK charity umbrella organisation that does work around violence against Black and minoritised women and girls in relation to different forms of violence and abuse. They've been going, I think it says on your website 20 years, but I think some of you were doing quite a bit of work on that before
Yes.
that. So just to flag, they've been around a long time. They know a lot about this work, and they've also been instrumental in looking at legislation and policy. So really, really good organisation and a good source of resources if you need to get additional information. We also have Professor Ravi Thiara, who's from Warwick University, who again has worked with Imkaan and worked independently at University of Warwick on issues around well-being, violence against women, and in particular looking at Black and minoritized women and their experiences of health, well-being, and in terms of abuse as well. Again, 30 years, I'm going to guess there, Ravi. Um, so we're really, really pleased that they're here today to talk to us about this new report. I'm going to share the screen in a second, and I'm going to hand over to them. They're going to talk for a while. If you've got questions you need to put in the chat, that's fine. But then we will have a question and answer session at the end, discussion. If anybody wants to ask a question and doesn't want it recording, if you wait at the end of the kind of chat, I'll stop the recording, let you know we have stopped. And if there's anything you wanted to ask outside of that, that's fine as well. Okay, so over to you two. I'm going to share the screen. I haven't used Zoom for a while, so this is, yeah, that's what you press. There we go.
Shall I start, Emma?
Yep, over
While
to
you're
you.
doing that?
Yes,
Okay, thank
please.
you. Thanks so much, Emma. And thanks for having us to share some kind of key highlights um, from our report. It's a pleasure to do so. So we launched this report, Why Should Our Age Be Tidy, in November in Parliament. And as Emma said, you know, it's available to you and hopefully will be circulated as part of, you know, your involvement in the network. Um, so I think, you know, when we look at issues of mental well-being and trauma, we now have a well-established literature base which looks at the links between violence and abuse and the far-reaching and wide-ranging and enduring consequences it has across the life course for survivors' mental health and well-being. And there's extensive research that highlights the ripples, and I use here Bufacchi and Gilson's phrase. So the ripples across all significant aspects of survivors' lives. And Bufacchi and Gilson argue, for instance, in relation to their work on sexual violence, that rape is not an event, but an experience with enduring and radiating consequences, especially when there's an absence of a listening or supportive community or an absence of positive responses. So I think the impact of violence and abuse on psychological well-being can also be regarded in this way, you know, in terms of considering the ripples that continue to exist for years and years after. And the evidence base for those who are structurally marginalised and minoritised survivors has been limited, though some research has highlighted kind of the differentiated experiences of mainly South Asian women. And that research has revealed higher levels of depression, anxiety, suicide, and suicide attempts among young Asian women, for instance. But there is other research in the health inequalities arena, which has revealed the punitive and medicalized responses to the coercive care for racialized minorities, especially for Black Caribbean groups. But little has really been done specifically on the linkage between mental health and well-being in a context of violence and abuse. Next slide, please, Emma. So our study was funded by the Violence and Abuse Mental Health Network, which some of you might be aware of. And it was a collaboration between myself at Warwick, Imkaan, and also Women and Girls Network, which is an organisation that's probably existed for much longer than we've been working in this area, primarily based in London. It was a largely qualitative study. And we also worked with a group of lived experience experts, if you like, but they preferred to be seen as survivor activists. So we interviewed a highly diverse group of women who were aged between 22 and 52 years, largely African, Caribbean, Pakistani, and Indian survivors, but there were also fewer numbers of Afghani, Iraqi, Kurdish, Bangladeshi, and mixed heritage women. Almost a third had insecure immigration, and I think that's significant. And they'd been supported for sort of anything between 2 months and 4.5 years by the organisation which we approached. The survivors' voices sit very much at the heart of our research and ensure the findings are rooted in their realities. And having the Survivor Activist Advisory Group was of great value to us. They also engaged in a listening project which generated valuable ideas, not only about what's malfunctioning in our support system for Black and minoritized survivors, but also what's required for change. So Why Should Our Age Be Tidy is amongst the first to document in detail the specific experiences of Black and minoritized survivors. And I think it invites us to engage with and reflect on the issues and challenges that they have to navigate, even whilst their mental well-being is eroded and sometimes misunderstood. So the dominant response to survivors has been to psychopathologize their distress and trauma in contexts of violence and abuse. And that is something that's increasingly coming under criticism. There's always been that critique of the dominant response, but I think, you know, there's been increasing criticism of that. And that's part, you know, as a part of the wider critique of the medicalization of everyday life. For us, it was certainly crucial to locate the mental health impacts of violence and abuse within gendered and racialized social relations, rather than seeing them as a deficit within individual bodies. Next slide, please. And where I've got quotes on the slides, I am going to leave you to read those. So do that. So intersectional location and the situational context both mediate women's experiences of violence and abuse and their psychological distress, the effects, and how they're treated or responded to by our support system. So it was evident really from our findings that the context in which abuse was experienced and the obstacles to securing positive interventions all impacted on survivors' mental health and well-being. So it wasn't just simply the experience of the abuse, but also what happened afterwards as they tried to navigate help seeking. Intersecting abuse, you know, incorporated every facet of their lives. This is no surprise to those of us who work in this area. And it was aimed at completely eroding their sense of self, And, you know, pointed their experiences of abuse pointed to high levels of coercive control that were perpetuated often by multiple people through surveillance, coercion, and intimidation across the life course, and all of which, of course, impacted their mental health and well-being. So the survivors we spoke to talked about greater levels and intensity of abuse, a longer period that it had been endured in, greater levels of extreme coerced social isolation and emotional neglect. They talked about a weaponization of their insecure immigration status. They also talked about high levels of daily sexual violence and economic abuse and dependence. And they also, you know, told us about the multiple silencing factors that they had to endure. And this abuse in their personal lives and the ways in which it was silenced was reinforced by structural violence, and that's through discriminatory service responses, as well as a hostile immigration and asylum system, you know, interaction with which all further and, you know, serve to undermine women's well-being. So you know, in the many ways that they told us, it was apparent that the structural, the cultural, and the interpersonal combined to produce wider forms of abuse, deeper impacts, and to ultimately restrict women's options and what Liz Kelly and Sharp Jeffs have referred to as their space for action. Next slides, please. So women recounted mental health challenges that some had previously never experienced, didn't recognise, and which also manifested in physical symptoms. The corrosive impact of abuse for them was a slow, insidious process. So women talked about an overriding sense of betrayal and loss, and this was really dominant in their narratives, and that was both in intimate and family relationships, but also in their interaction with professionals and the support system. So we know from Evan Stark's work that the loss of liberty, identity, and autonomy are at the heart of coercive control. And the multiple ways in which their identity and autonomy was undermined was highlighted in women's narratives. They talked about a loss of self, loss of family, community, and social support, and they talked about a loss of stability and security within a wider sense of betrayal, which left women with a deep feeling of an eroded self and identity. So, you know, they talked about losing themselves and overwhelming feelings of hopelessness. In fact, you know, they felt crushed. And when this happens, they question their very being and regard themselves as having failed in meeting the, you know, the often gendered expectations others had of them. And many describe this as becoming quiet inside, though this quietness was also underpinned by a deep anger. Next slide, please, Emma. So in terms of the silencing factors that I mentioned earlier, similar factors existed in silencing women about mental health, their mental health, as they did about the abuse that they were subjected to. And, you know, this is the violence of silence that others have talked about. And fear of stigma and shame within their communities often led women, you know, often led to pressure on women to cover up issues. And this erasure further complicates women's attempts to navigate a path to recovery. And knowing the ways in which any sign of mental ill health could be weaponized by men and often their families, where, you know, women are constructed as mad, also through the system like the family courts and often within social services and within social networks, women resisted stigma and shame by coping on their own and what they described as holding it in. And for some, this led to somatization and a presentation physical symptoms, to their GPs, for instance. And of course, holding it in didn't remove the deep sense of shame, personal, family, and community, and self-blame, which featured large in women's narratives. So for Caribbean women, this was because of, what's been termed as race loyalty, or loyalty to the race. And that's imperative to not reinforce racialized assumptions about broken Black families, as well as kind of the pressure to be strong, what's referred to in the literature as the strong Black woman trope. For Asian and Middle Eastern women, stigma of mental health in their communities was a big factor. And what all of this meant is that not only did women have to cope with the impacts of abuse, but they had to, also navigate and manage gendered expectations about protecting men and their families and their communities from external scrutiny, with, clear negative consequences for their own well-being and their healing. And links with kind of past histories of oppression and intergenerational trauma were acknowledged in the pressure to appear strong and mask weakness. And all of this then served to deny survivors help and support. They spoke about not being heard, but being seen as crazy, not being believed, and being blamed. And this isn't to say that Black and minoritized women don't resist abuse and the negative labeling and silencing of their psychological distress. And I think women's agency was evident in their actions to effect change in their situations, even if it took several years. And they'd started to reframe all of these silencing pressures through their recovery journeys and their contact, particularly with by and for services. Next slide, please. So how the system of support reinscribes trauma was another major thread in women's narratives. The differential treatment and outcomes for Black and minoritized communities and failure to address these have been repeatedly highlighted by research. And this wider context, I think, has a bearing on the ways in which survivors experience their interactions with health support systems. And for the women that we interviewed, the trauma of abuse was compounded by the trauma of racism, both historic and current. And in the face of the violence of dehumanization that they experienced, women repeatedly asked the question, why can't we be seen as human beings, in a context where they felt treated as less than human? Racialized assumptions that were different for different groups of women underpinned professional responses, being regarded as an angry Black woman and an undeserving victim because women presented as strong and coping. That's the masking that I was talking about. And sometimes adultification was repeatedly raised by Caribbean women. Others were regarded as having no agency and uniformly victimized by overly oppressive men, families, and cultures. And all of these responses failed to recognize women's challenges with regards to their abuse-linked mental well-being. The next slide, please. So in general, professionals were experienced as having little professional curiosity when dealing with them. There was a sense of being treated and made to feel as less than human. And the absence of people wanting to help was a source of frustration and at times pain for women. And finding it hard to challenge their treatment by services and professionals, women spoke about the ways in which racism wounds compound the wounds of abuse, with few spaces that enable them to repair. Next slide, please, Emma. So, worryingly, women's interactions with health professionals were dominated by an overwhelmingly medicalized response and show a lack of understanding and engagement with their histories of abuse. The failure of professionals to link their experiences of abuse and their diverse presentations of trauma was repeatedly highlighted. So women had rarely been asked about any underlying reasons for their eroded mental well-being, and instead they spoke about the medicalization of their issues, where GPs, who were often the first port of call for most, routinely prescribed medication without much explanation of what it would do, rather than refer women for counselling or therapeutic interventions, though even when this was done, these were experienced as inappropriate by most of the women. So effectively, women were being medicated to deal with men's violence. And as a woman said, and I quote, "I didn't need medication, I just needed to talk. I took it because the GP said you need to calm down." And as you can see in the quote, another said, "I was offered medicine 5 times before he mentioned the word therapy to me. And I think my reason for wanting the drugs in the end was because I just wanted to stop feeling how I was feeling." Next slide, please. So pathologization of survivors' trauma was commonplace, especially through the diagnosis of BPD. And that was a concern to some women that we spoke to. And also in a context of racialization, the potential for misdiagnosis is obvious. So if racialization reinforces the rendering of abused women as mad, either because they don't fit the normative view of the deserving victim, or they're deemed to be aggressive and angry and full of unpredictable rage, which can be central to some psychiatric labels, or they're regarded as too weak to speak for themselves, a question that arises is what barriers to justice are created for some of the most marginalized survivors. How do you hold your abuser to account and get justice or challenge a discriminatory system if you're deemed to have a personality disorder and thus be an unreliable narrator of your own abuse and trauma experiences? And within that context, how do you find healing? And the consequences of diagnosis often reached after an hour session with a psychologist for women from communities already pathologized are immense. Women were clear that the trauma of racism and of abuse together made their healing journeys daunting, and racism was thought to stop professionals from seeing them as a whole person. And you can see some of the quotes here, where a woman says, "I felt the BPD was like a kick in the head. It's like I've been through all this trauma during my childhood, and now you're telling me I'm sort of mad, bad person." Knowing they were misdiagnosed led women to view it as an injustice against survivors, as this quote highlights, and with lifelong and far-reaching and stigmatizing implications for their lives. And it wasn't that women didn't require help, but they were desperate for those with understanding and insight about their situations to guide them in a way that would enable them to start healing. And without this, being given a diagnosis to them felt like a punishment rather than being understood. And ironically, and this was interesting, diagnosis was necessary for women to access support in some cases. And in the face of professionals who had an inadequate understanding of the linkage between abuse and mental health, having a diagnosis became a way for some women to be taken seriously and to access help. So diagnosis for some was not only resisted, but also embraced. So I'll stop there and let Sumanta come in. Sumanta, over to you.
Thanks, Ravi. Next slide, please, Emma. So you've heard from Ravi talking about, violence and abuse, and you will be very familiar when you experience violence and abuse from someone close. It often left women with this overwhelming sense of betrayal, loss, breach of trust, and emotional wounds and harm. So what healing from this relational injury requires is for us to focus our work with survivors on what we frame as relational repair. We spoke to women who shared, as you know, the challenges that they encountered, but they also spoke about the positive and important elements of their healing journeys. So, what does that look like? Next slide, please. Women emphasize the importance of slow work, being seen as a whole person, and for practitioners to have a wraparound sense of understanding to counteract the dehumanizing impact of their contact with mainstream statutory professionals. Women emphasize the cruciality of specialist trauma-informed support provided by and for organisations. They also talked about the pivotal role of these organisations in undoing the added distress and harm caused by the system that left women feeling powerless, as you've heard, where they were labelled as mad or angry, and which often then led to their disengagement from mainstream support. These were spaces that were described as spaces of understanding, warmth, human connection, where they could speak to someone from a similar background without having to repeat themselves, teach or educate. Significantly, these were the spaces where their trauma responses to violence and abuse were normalized and where they were helped to actually start to regain their strength and confidence to heal. When survivors were validated and supported to make sense of what was happening to them physically, emotionally, spiritually, as a consequence of the abuse, importantly, and unsilenced the silencing. Women also spoke about the importance of continuity of support, so reaching a point of stability and safety before they were ready to begin that healing journey. They also talked about longer term support. That was essential because it helped women to make decisions that felt incredibly impossible earlier. For some, that might mean supporting a prosecution, or it may have meant receiving immigration-based support and advocacy before they were ready to enter a space to address the recovery. They also said it's not just talking. They talked about the value of bespoke interventions. So one survivor said, told us we need to look at what women actually need and what's going to cause the least distress, as not everybody wants to sit down and chat. So that could have included EDMR therapy, body therapies, emotional support to engage with activities with their peers. As long as alongside having that space for healing, the importance of a trusted advocate was highlighted, someone that could walk with them during their help-seeking journey and hold agencies to account to challenge systemic racism and discrimination. Women had to feel ready, a sense of readiness for formal counselling, so many spoke about the value of a less structured approach, something that was much more formal, flexible, informal emotional support at the point they needed it, rather than formal weekly sessions. Building relationships with a supportive community of survivors offered validation, reduced social isolation that many of these women had experienced, and also using their experiences to engage in survivor activism to create wider system change was key to shifting power and healing. It was very evident that with the right support, women were helped to reframe the negative view of themselves, feelings of self-blame and shame imposed by others, and gained greater personal insights. Next slide, please. Minoritized women were often in contact with specialist VAUG support services, often much later than they should have been, in the absence of, timely support, referral across the mental health system. These organisations that we spoke to often seeing women who'd never accessed any formal support before, when women were essentially at the other end of the help-seeking process, often at that point where their symptoms had become much more complex, much more entrenched. They were often intervening when women were in crisis after they'd been in and out of the mental health system, sometimes for many years, which creates a revolving door and this increased anxiety, feelings of insecurity and helplessness rather than alleviate it. Integrated VAUG trauma-informed pathways, early access to support is really essential if we're really serious about preventing mental health issues becoming more serious and chronic. And yet we were told that there was often an expectation from the statutory mainstream sector that this complexity should be picked up solely by, the specialist by and for organisation without, little limited consideration, should I say, of statutory accountability, the resources or capacity. of the organisation they were referring cases to. Yet without these organisations, women also told us they would literally have had nowhere to go. We also spoke to practitioners who also shared the many, the organisational constraints within which they were trying to deliver mental health support. And these organisations provide such an important alternative to the generic short-term CBT or IAPT interventions that women sometimes had to wait for a year or even 2 years to access through the NHS. They spoke about being forced because of the system, being forced to limit and narrow the scope of their clinical trauma work because of a lack of and short-term funding approaches, which places our organisations sometimes under pressure to respond to complex layered trauma within 10 to 12 sessions of counselling sometimes. The relational support which women value requires diverse leadership and support structures, yet only 4% of therapists themselves come from Black and minoritised communities. And this lack of diversity often alienated women that needed mental health support. So there are important questions here also about, how to address the systematic barriers to entry and retention in the mental health workforce. Next slide, please. The phrase trauma-informed has been, it's quite a popular phrase. It's sort of been, a common phrase that's used a lot. Yet how can we claim to be trauma-informed unless we address these structural inequalities? So there's a very strong call for everyone we spoke to in this piece of research for honest, reflective, conscious practice and commitment from senior leaders to identify and address, the everyday structural barriers across the mental health system and other statutory systems of support, whether that's policing or social care, ensuring that professionals across the health and mental health sector and other statutory services are trained to understand the links between violence and abuse and trauma through an intersectional lens, for there to be much greater attention towards identifying the internal risks of violence and abuse that we know have really far-reaching consequences, including depression, self-harm, suicide, which have been neglected because, some of the tools and approaches to assessment and referral, within statutory systems tend to be, you're taken more seriously if you've had physical injuries. Sadly, this issue has come to the forefront. There's an inquest at the moment into the suicide of Michelle Sparman, a Caribbean woman in 2021, and the family, with the support of AVTA and SBS, have raised concerns about coercive controlling behaviour by her ex-partner prior to her death. And so with some lobbying and advocacy, the inquest will now look at domestic abuse and whether any agencies had failed in their duty to protect her. There was a strong sense amongst the practitioners that we spoke to that, holistic forms of recovery work delivered in the specialist women's sector was undervalued by mainstream agencies and policymakers. Funders and policy leads were encouraged to be more innovative, to invest in non-Eurocentric forms of preventative recovery, longer-term holistic support in the bar and force sector as an alternative to the medical and pathologizing response women received. Some shared lessons from other parts of the world where psychoeducational work is integrated across the policing, social care and health systems, for example, where you have psychotherapists that are allocated to take statements from survivors in place of the police, or where statements are only taken from rape survivors after 48 hours and 2 sleep cycles in recognition of the way in which trauma impacts memory. Next slide, please. The report contains a call to action and a charter with 7 clear and very uncompromising demands for dignity and changes in policy and practice developed by the survivor activists who formed part of our lived experience advisory group that Ravi mentioned. They make some clear calls for change. The charter is available on the Imkaan website alongside the report. They talk about being treated with dignity and respect by all services, for systems to work in ways that see and respond to the racialized and gendered harms and ripples of trauma, to understand that vulnerabilities and agency can coexist, but not through racialized assumptions or stereotypes, to gauge with the reality that healing isn't a linear process, to see systems reform to protect rather than re-traumatize, ensure that funding and resources reach organisations that truly understand their needs, such as those within the burn for and, of course, the VORG sector. Next slide, please. We've got a series of detailed recommendations in the report, and Imkaan will be continuing to work with co-authors to push for changes through targeted strategic advocacy and others in the sector. We're planning a national seminar in June, and foregrounding health and mental health will form a key part of our ongoing work to influence the government's forthcoming VOG strategy. Imkaan and RSI actually were recently both at the same roundtable meeting with ministers to discuss, shared issues, mutual issues of concern. And incredibly, we were told that it was the first time that this type of cross-government discussion had taken place, which seems quite incredible, really. We know that the minister also recently raised the issue of hidden homicides in Parliament, so it's sort of somewhat on the radar, but there's a lot more work to do. We want the government to prioritise these issues nationally, convene some sort of national task force, so that we can better understand care pathways, barriers to access, and mental health inequalities, importantly. We'd like the government to appoint a mental health commissioner to advocate for the needs of women and minoritised women. We need better quality intersectional data so that we've got a better understanding of and we can address the systemic racial disparities that lead to minoritised women being more likely to be treated via a psychiatric medical pathway rather than a VOG trauma-informed one. Why are Black and minoritised communities 3.5 times more likely to end up in mental health detention? These are critical questions for us. Next slide, please. At local level, we need health services commissioners to engage in, the types of holistic intersectional work that happens on a local level, delivered by specialist minoritised-led VOG organisations. They need to appreciate the role of these organisations play in early intervention and prevention. But we know that, only a handful of Imkaan members receive any NHS funding if they do at all to deliver independent therapeutic support. And often in the absence of resources, you have frontline staff who often find themselves providing emotional support on top of day-to-day casework and advocacy. We need the local integrated care boards to collaborate more with specialists to create mental health strategies that have a stronger and specific focus on race, gender, and violence against women and girls. And we spoke earlier about to counteract the systematic re-traumatization of women. We need, training in statutory settings by specialists, Black and minoritised organisations on VOG-related trauma and intersectionality. When we talk about cultural competency, we need training that centres VOG, but without racially pathologising minoritised communities. And importantly, we need to start treating access to mental health support as a form of social justice. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in attending our online national seminar, we can provide some details. We'll be providing some details through RSI. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, both of you. Before I jump in with questions, I was right. Every time I was writing a question, you asked me to move a slide. So hopefully I did all right with that. Can I open it up to anybody who has a question? Yeah, Caroline, go.
I can't find my hand. I'm used to Teams now. Just really powerful. And the connections between the mental health and the psychiatric fields as well. It's shocking, isn't it? I just want to say thank you. It was really powerful. And I wonder, I suppose, on a real practical level, I mean, there's lots of recommendations that will take a long time to implement, if indeed they are implemented and, the forces work together to make it happen. So in the meantime, on a practical level, what can I do? I suppose is something that I'm wondering. What can I do to try and make a difference in the services that I oversee at NIA? And how can we do better in the absence of the longer term changes?
Sumanta, do you want to come in, or do you want me
Some
to?
practical things would be, and Naya, obviously you're well positioned. You've got good links with probably a lot of our Imkaan members as well. Even just to start to broker a conversation with some local buy-in for organisations around what the local responses are looking like, what the local strategy is looking like, what, you know, what is being said and what isn't being said, how the referrals are working on a practical level. You actually have, you know, in East London, actually, one of our members is funded. One of our members is funded to deliver therapeutic support through the NHS via their IAP pathway, and have been for quite a long time. So that, you know, just starting to have conversations around how to ensure that women are accessing support earlier it would be a really great, important thing to do. Or even, you know, within your kind of local integrated boards, they seem to be these kind of meetings that take place, but we're not quite clear about the level of engagement there is with the VOG sector, let alone the buy and fall sector, right? Yeah, so there's just some stuff around pushing some strategic conversations. And yeah, and obviously we're always happy to present findings where we can try and influence, you know, on a local level. A few thoughts. Ravi, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've said everything really.
Yeah, so if I can take chair's privilege and jump in here. So I think thinking about Iris in particular, but also Advise, the two programs that we run, the two things. Firstly, members who have access to the steering group, which has members of the local ICB on, has key stakeholders involved in health to be raising some of these issues. Obviously, the practitioners, the advocate educators on the ground are providing, I know it is a buzzword, trauma-informed care, but really trying to think about what it is that a patient who's referred in needs, and to actually meet those needs rather than making assumptions. But also thinking about in the training with clinicians and non-clinicians as well, in GP practices or sexual health clinics. I think those questions about how to ask and what to ask, and which we train on. And again, just being clear that rather than pathologizing, that actually the referral into somebody who can then have that conversation and think about what the best trauma-informed support might look like is what Iris is meant to do. So I think having those conversations, and for people on the call to have a think about how they put those messages across to make sure that clinicians aren't missing people, because and what strikes me is it's the contradiction, but people seen as passive and culturally oppressed and passive, or angry Black women, obviously contradictions there, but to actually think, well, is that what's being perpetuated, and how do I get through to clinicians to say, actually, if you having those thoughts, they are exactly the patients that you need to be referring in for somebody else to have those conversations, so there isn't that additional trauma, re-traumatization, I guess. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that.
I think just quickly to pick up on that, I think GPs are really pivotally placed, because, you know, that they're the first port of call, and if the response is to offer women, you know, medication rather than to even ask, and we know from the literature that South Asian women especially are less likely to be referred for talking therapies or therapeutic support, and more likely to be given medication, you know, is to kind of start challenging that response. I think is really important. I mean, you know, GPs are a gateway, but there's other things that happens, you know, even if a GP refers a woman to some kind of therapeutic intervention, you know, there's a lot that happens further down the line that, you know, that's problematic. Yeah. And often women are having to wait, you know, a long time, you know, sometimes up to a year to get to a session with a white male, which, you know, a woman told us about who just didn't get it. And, you know, so I don't know what GPs can do in that situation, but, you know, these are things to be aware of.
Caroline, did you want to come in again? Yep.
I suppose we deliver Iris and we deliver Advise service. Well, the Advise funding, unfortunately, is coming to an end now. It's and the training does provide a platform to the kind of frontline response, but not necessarily more senior.
Right.
And I suppose that's where some of the analysis needs to happen, isn't it, really, in terms of them looking at what's happening, the trends, what are they doing, what's informing that thinking, what's the training, what happens, because we don't reach those people necessarily through the programme. I suppose what I do think as well, and I'm not entirely sure if I haven't got the stats to back it up at this point, but certainly when overseeing the quarterly reports in Iris and Advise, what did strike me as quite interesting, like Iris is obviously for GPs and Advise is in the sexual health clinics, and there seemed to be a higher number of Black and minoritised women coming through the sexual health clinics. I'm about to do the end of year report, more so than the Iris services, like people are going to speak to their GPs. So that's something I'm gonna go back and have a look at now and just see, because that sounds like that's consistent really with what you're talking about today as well. I'm gonna go and have a look at that at the end of year reports.
Yeah, I think the comparison between the two in, say, your site would work. We obviously can't nationally, it doesn't work because the sexual health clinic interventions are often in cities and the demographics would be different. So so we can't do the national comparative on that data, but you could locally, because you know it's the same population. You do also get with the sexual health clinics because it's more so you get people coming from outside of that area in as well. So whereas Iris is more locally based, you get more of a hub. So I'm thinking about the Manchester one, for example. A lot of people who live in Greater Manchester, where the Iris perhaps is or isn't operating, may still come into the centre of Manchester for the sexual health services. So they're coming into a different area for the sexual health interventions. So it's just, but that shouldn't be happening. Might be happening with you, but just to think about that with that comparative,
that's useful to think about because it's both Hackney, so you can have a look at the boroughs as well. Yeah, definitely.
That's really interesting for us to know as well, be alert to. And at one level, you know, Caroline, are you talking about sort of GPs referring women to sexual health clinics or
Iris
directly accessing?
So where there's Iris, GPs would be, or staff within the primary care team will be referring into Iris, and Advises where sexual health staff will be referring into Advice. Similar model. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jen. I'm a pharmacist and then also do some work with Iris. And I just think the comment about the medication from the GP route being a barrier to proper support and care is just a really real issue. And I think that's being looked at wider in terms of mental health. And there's a real move towards using antidepressants and medication less. But I think it is a real, in a short GP consultation time, when you have been told there is a medication that may help, it's such an easy, quick win to go with that. But I think that really prevents access to proper care in many, many situations. I don't have any solutions, just a comment.
Thanks, Jen.
And I think you know, part of it is, and I forgot to make this point earlier when I was talking about GPs being a kind of, you know, a gateway, is about what Sumanta was saying around, you know, linking up with services, VORG services, specialist, you know, VORG or specialist by and for services in the area, because they're the services that survivors are saying they value, that they find most, but you know, a lot of meaning and connection and recovery and healing in. So even, you know, within, I'm sure you're doing this through your work, but just to kind of emphasize the importance of linking in and referring women earlier into those services, I think would make a qualitative difference to their experiences.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that women talked a lot about, didn't they, Ravi, was the entrenched social isolation. So when, you know, the daunting nature of the system and where to go, and if they were being processed through a psychiatric route and everything. So the sooner you can try and break that kind of social isolation aspect, you find that, you know, you'd be finding that women would be being able to explore other kinds of therapeutic approaches, from body therapies or informal peer support groups, you know, less costly, you know, for the NHS, costly for women and costly for the NHS. So there is something there that's kind of sort of fragmented there in terms of an approach, but maybe there's something that could be explored between the IRIS advocate educators. But I know that's also funding and resources, and is an issue for everyone. I know that's a real live issue, but there's something around some partnership, collaboration or something that could be explored between buy and force services and advocate educators. But yeah.
Any other comment? Helen's got a hand raised. Yeah, Helen.
Hiya. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. It just made me think we have a slightly different model in Devon, but we have a male practitioner who is from Namibia, and it was only yesterday he was talking about a client he'd recently seen who I think was from Nigeria, and the reaction he'd had from her was so grateful that she had someone that she could relate to, and that it was things like I think he specifically said that he would understand relate like references to witchcraft and things that she's experienced back in her country before she's come to the UK, that she didn't feel that she would be able to explain to maybe a British born person. So I think the buy and for, like as much as possible, it does set people at ease. And it just reminded me of a conversation we were having yesterday at work with one of our male practitioners who had experienced that. So yeah, I think when those services exist, it's possible, and it's also possible, I suppose, to build them in. Sometimes if you can sort of recruit a more diverse workforce. So yeah, that was it.
Thank you, Helen. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we are coming up to an hour anyway. I want to thank you both for your presentation today. Certainly got me thinking about what we do and how we can improve what we do. I think certainly over the past few years, we've tried to really advocate for buy and for organisations in the different localities that we work in. So we have sites across the UK. So certainly collaborating with those organisations, and many of our IRIS and advice sites are run by those organisations locally as well. But certainly looking at how we can move that forward, and continuing to have those conversations. I think the fact that you have sat around the table now with the relevant ministers and can be pushing jointly, we can be working together to make sure that these issues are flagged. Yeah, and just a reminder to everybody when they are out and about doing that training, that they can flag these issues there as well with clinicians, whether it's around how you ask. We do an exercise around why doesn't she leave, for example. You've just given us a whole list of reasons why somebody doesn't leave or doesn't even accept, won't answer the question to where there can be help put in place. So they're all really good examples that people can use when they're doing the training as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording.